Hi everybody. It's been a while since I made a video. There's been a lot going on, but I'm back and a new location where you can definitely see the fisheye quality of my webcam, but it is what it is, so let's get into the video. Today we're going to talk about a sort of a lesser known case. This is the case of the disappearance of Randy Leach. And even though this is maybe a little lesser known of a case, I don't really know why. I find it kind of interesting, even if what most people probably presume to be the likely reason for his disappearance is fairly simple. I still think it's a pretty interesting case, especially given what was going on around the time of his disappearance and how that played into the wider cultural stuff that the country was going through at the time. This is the U.S. So let's just get into the story. Some accounts of Randy's disappearance vary in terms of the timeline. There were a lot of different people really around that night, but not all of them were the most reliable witnesses, and some of them were under the influence, and it just sort of varies a little. For the most part, I don't think that the differences matter that much, but for the most part, I'm using the timeline which is listed on the In Search of Randy website, which is connected to Randy's family and which will of course be linked down in the description below. Randy Leach was born on July 25th, 1970, and at the time of his birth he weighed only 4 pounds. He was his parents, Harold and Alberta's only child, and they absolutely adored him. Randy grew up to be quite tall. He was an athlete, and on April 15th, 1988, Randy Leach was just 17 years old and 1 week away from graduating from Linwood High School in Linwood, Kansas. He was supposedly in a good mood that day and excited that his father had bought him a new lawn tractor just the day before. That evening at about 6:45 p.m., after giving his mother a kiss and saying goodbye to his father, he got into his mother's car, a 1985 Dodge 600 four-door sedan, and left his home for the last time. He made a stop at his cousin's house in Linwood, Kansas, and then drove to nearby DeSoto, Kansas to check on his beloved 1969 Mustang, which he was having restored. Next, he went to a convenience store where he bought a couple candy bars, a couple bottles of soda, and some gas. Then he headed to a classmate's graduation party, which is being held only 5 miles away from his family's home. By 10 p.m., Randy was seen at this party. He was definitely there. There were plenty of witnesses. And according to witnesses, there was anywhere between 45 to 150 people at the party, and not uncommon for teen parties that size, there was drinking and drug use going on. Randy's mother said that Randy wasn't involved in drugs, and some of his friends said the same thing, that he wasn't really a big drinker or anything. But it's not unusual for teens to be pretty good at hiding things like that from their parents. I'm not saying that that was the case with Randy, but there were witnesses at the party who said Randy seemed sort of out of it, and it was possibly due to alcohol or drugs. One witness said that Randy seemed to have some trouble walking, but it didn't necessarily seem like he was drunk, and that she never saw him actually drinking. Others said that they did see him drinking. A friend of Randy's, Stephen Haig, said that Randy wasn't really a drinker, but he seemed to be either drunk or high that night. Randy, like I said, he was a big guy. He was 6'3", around 190 centimeters tall, and weighed about 220 pounds or 100 kilograms. And he was an athlete. He was a big guy. Even if he snuck a drink or two when no one saw, it's unlikely that a guy of his size would have even gotten tipsy from that, let alone be noticeably affected. It's also possible if he did consume some type of alcohol or drugs, it could have happened by accident, or by even being intentionally drugged, although there's no real definitive evidence of him using or not using intentionally or unintentionally, either way. There was, however, a bad crowd at this party. There's a little bit of like class warfare going on in this story as well, which I'm not going to get into too much because I don't think it's really a factor. But there were some kids who were, the more alternative kids who kind of got targeted with suspicion in this case, even though it's unlikely that they had anything to do with it. Reports initially said that Randy left the party at around 2 a.m., although it's unclear if anyone actually saw him leave. Regardless, he never made it home. Someone else at the party, someone named John Burns, who was acting as sort of an unofficial designated driver, he was going to take Randy home at about 1:30 a.m., but Randy couldn't find the keys to the car that he drove, his mother's car, possibly because someone had taken them from him earlier to keep him from driving while under the influence. But Burns told Randy to look for the keys and to wait by the car, and then he left to drive someone else home. Supposedly, a little bit after 2 a.m., Randy was seen in the house waiting to use the bathroom. And when Burns returned to the house at about 2:30 a.m. to see if Randy had found his keys and was ready to be driven home, Randy and his car were no longer there. When Randy's parents woke up the next morning at about 6 a.m., they found that Randy had never come home. And they knew that something was wrong, as Randy had a curfew and he tended to stick to it pretty well. When they went outside, they saw an acquaintance of Randy, a man named Steve Dougherty, drive by the house, which they found odd in retrospect, as he had been going very slowly, only about 10 miles an hour, even though the speed limit on the road was over 50. Later, they would find out that Steve had spent time with Randy the day before and had actually been one of the last people to have seen him. Randy's parents called his friends, but no one had heard from him since the party, so they filed a missing persons report as soon as they could, though they had to wait a mandatory 24-hour waiting period, which is unfortunate, fearing that he may have been involved in a car accident. The morning that they found him to be missing, Randy's uncle, Richard Rose, who was a police officer in the nearby town of Lawrence, Kansas, went out to the farm where the party had taken place the night before, and according to him, no one at the house offered any help. The area had been completely cleared and cleaned up after the party, and according to him, quote, "You couldn't even have told there was a party there," end quote. Not too long after the party, the house actually burned to the ground without the police ever doing a search of it, which is kind of strange. Although the police did put out a missing persons report, according to Alberta, Randy's mom, the police initially believed that Randy had just left on his own. Unfortunately, this sort of assumption is not unusual and can cause really unfortunate delays in cases of missing children or even adults. Randy had a bank account that he never touched after his disappearance, and his mother said that he would never have left his Mustang behind. He really loved this Mustang. It was his greatest possession, and he was really looking forward to getting it fully fixed up and being able to drive it around. Eventually, an investigation by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation determined that Randy didn't leave voluntarily, and that foul play was likely a cause of his disappearance. What exactly they came up with to determine that is unclear, because it's a difficult case to investigate, as there's essentially no real evidence. Randy just sort of disappeared, and witnesses have not been able to be very helpful, and some have even passed away in the 30-plus years since the events took place. And if there was a lot of drinking and drug use going on, that could explain why many people's memory is a bit hazy, either because they were really out of it themselves or because they were afraid they could get into some kind of trouble for what happened. If it did involve Randy and drugs, maybe if someone had given him some, or even if someone was known to have had some drugs at the party that night, there's just not a lot of solid facts to go off of. But there are a lot of rumors, however. One of the more famous rumors or theories about the case is that some people in the community or even the surrounding areas were involved in Satanism, and that they had abducted and killed Randy as some part of some kind of ritual. Satanic panic was definitely going on at this point. This was the 80s. It was really really a driving force in a lot of stigmatization of, rock music, metal music, the goth sort of culture, even anyone who didn't prescribe to a certain form of Christianity, which was acceptable. A lot of disappearances and murders were blamed on it, often without any real merit. And one man in particular, one young man, was even questioned about whether he was a Satanist in this case. And although he said he had read the Satanic Bible, he didn't really believe in any kind of religion. And he was questioned after a classmate told a detective that this man had taken out a knife in a Walmart parking lot and said, quote, "This is what we use to sacrifice Randy." End quote. He was also known for having dyed black hair, listened to a lot of heavy metal music, and enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons, the most dangerous thing of all. Some people thought it was even directly related to Satanism. The detective who interviewed him said that this guy had never even actually played Dungeons and Dragons, but I guess a couple of D&D books had been found in his car. Not that that really means anything. There were actually several other people also accused of Satanism, and in 1993, this was a few years after the disappearance, 3 people were actually arrested, at least one of which was accused of Satanism, although they were soon released after the sheriff at the time determined there was not actually any probable cause for their arrest. Moving on, another theory in Randy's disappearance is that after overdosing on something at the party, one or more of his peers had cut up and disposed of his body. One man in particular was even accused of doing just that after having left with Randy the night he disappeared, but that man was actually in jail when Randy disappeared, so there's nothing tying him to it. But possibly connected to this theory, about a year after Randy's disappearance, Steve Doherty, the man who Randy's parents had seen driving slowly by their house the morning after he disappeared, led police to a severed foot inside of a shoe, which he said he had found beside the river. And this foot was believed by police to not be connected to anything in Randy's case, and it was eventually proven through DNA testing that it wasn't Randy's. And it likely belonged to someone who had drowned after falling out of a boat on the river, and it could have floated a long way before it was eventually found. Another person that sort of came up with a theory for this case is a man who said that he had actually been taken hostage by a cult and kept in a cave for weeks. He claimed that he had seen another man's body, possibly Randy, hanging up in this cave, but the police investigated the cave and found nothing, and the man eventually later took his entire statement back, saying that he had been high. And the caves that were supposedly referenced in this story were actually supposedly destroyed in order to keep people from going in there. And a bunch of other strange events occurred after Randy's disappearance. The car that the Leaches had gotten to replace the one that went missing with Randy caught on fire, supposedly by a faulty gas line. According to Harold Leach, the place where Steve Doherty lived also caught on fire and burned down. Randy's dog went missing and was never found. Amid conflict with the investigators on the case, police reports began appearing in the Leach's mailbox. Randy's father said that he thought the reports came from someone working in the sheriff's office who was sympathetic to the family, because the Leaches were kind of having a hard time getting information about the investigation, possibly because there wasn't a lot of information to give, and the police didn't necessarily want to indicate that publicly. But it's also theorized that they came from an investigative reporter who may not have actually been an investigative reporter who was working on the case, and who may have been having an affair with the sheriff's wife. A different man from another nearby town, Topeka, came to volunteer to help with the case, the search for Randy, and not too long afterwards, he and his wife were found dead in what was determined to be a murder-suicide. But those are all kind of the crazy theories and possibly unrelated events surrounding the case. But another scenario, and quite possibly the most likely one, is a car accident, like his parents initially feared. The route that Randy is believed to have taken home that night, was what is now known as Golden Road, which was sort of a back road. It was less likely to have been patrolled by police, and if Randy had consumed any amount of alcohol or drugs, he probably would have wanted to avoid police. 30 years ago, there was a single-lane bridge over Golden Road, which at least one detective believes Randy may have accidentally driven off of. There were apparently no guardrails as you approached the bridge, so it could have been possible for someone to drive through that area and into the water below without really leaving any evidence of an accident. And this bridge has since been demolished, thankfully. Although some said that the creek below the bridge wasn't deep enough to hide a vehicle, apparently there had been a film shot the summer before Randy's disappearance, and this showed a car going off the bridge and sinking into the water. They did a search and actually did find a car in the water, but it wasn't Randy's. Apparently it's also possible that a car could have drifted down the creek, so it's possible Randy's car is somewhere in there and just hasn't been found. It's also possible that his car could have ended up in some sort of ditch or trench at the bottom of the creek and then was covered by sediment over the years. And since the creek and its connecting waters weren't searched by the police for at least 10 years after Randy disappeared, and it's now been over 30 years, it may be impossible to find the car if it is in the water. There have been multiple searches in ponds and waterways, including up to this year, but though some cars have been found and recovered, none of them have been the car that Randy was in that night. On January 28th of 2021, Randy's father, Harold, passed away after a long illness. And not long after, in February, the Facebook page that had been set up to help look for Randy was hacked. And obviously whoever did this is a garbage person, but there are apparently some people who hold some ill will towards Randy's family. They were very insistent on continuing the investigation into Randy's disappearance, perhaps at times targeting people unfairly that they may have suspected were involved, and that may have caused some people to not be very happy with them. There's also people who think that they pushed the police too hard, and there could have been some pushback with that as well. But again, not a whole lot of concrete evidence either way. And some people recently who were helping to search some areas of interest, both in Randy's disappearance as well as in some others, ended up deciding not to return to the area, at least in part because supposedly they had received some threats. So although it's most likely that Randy did have some sort of accident on the back road and likely ended up in the river, a lot of strange things have also still surrounded this case. And that is one of the reasons why I thought it was an interesting one to cover. It's also not as well known, and just getting any more attention to it is definitely something that I think could be valuable to his family. His mother is now continuing this journey alone, and it's just really sad overall. If Randy was still alive today, he would be 51 years old. So that's all I have for you guys today. I will have the links to the In Search of Randy website down below, which his family has been continuing on with since their Facebook page was hacked. I'll also put the Kansas Bureau of Investigation page for Randy down below. So if you do have any information, if you happen to have any, you can submit information, I believe, on either of those. So hopefully my schedule will continue on with more videos here. I just wasn't really able to film for a while, but here I am filming, so hopefully I can continue on doing that. I already have my next video mostly researched and planned out, so hopefully that'll be coming not too much later than this one. And then hopefully I'll have a couple sort of Halloween-y episodes to go over soon as well. So something to look forward to if I manage to do it. And until then, I will see you guys later. Bye.